Thanks, Craig. I'm really pleased to be chairing this keynote. I first heard Tanya speak at a conference, what feels like a million years ago. It wasn't really that long, but talking about Buffy and video games. And I saw this keynote she gave and thought, wow, this is so cool. And since that time, she's been kind of leading the way of video games discipline as a discipline. So she's the author of a range of books and papers that sought to distinguish the formal and aesthetic differences of games from other media. She's written extensively on the Gothic and horror in relation to game form. Since 2012, she's been the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed journal Games and Culture. She has designed and convened a range of games courses that provide students with the experience, knowledge, and skills needed for employment in the games industry. Tanya holds a chair in digital economy at Falmouth University and was director of the Games Academy that provides incubation-based and innovation-led game development and game art courses.
Thank you, Stacey. I'm reminded of the time we bumped into each other at the Witchcraft Museum in Boscastle.
I'm reminded of that too. Great minds.
Absolutely. Right, okay, I'm just going to kick my... So can you tell me if you can see this?
Hi. A major aim of this paper is to provide an overview of the presence of folk horror, iconography, settings, themes and structures in video games. Given that games present us with a modality of interaction absent from other media, it is also important to give some sense of how the formal characteristics of game media shape the articulation of folk horror in game contexts. Now, I can't talk about every game that refers to folk horror, obviously, but I want to talk about a number of games to give you a bit of a sense of the scope of what we're talking about and how it's used in different genres. I will, though, argue for what I'll term ludic folk horror, a brand of folk horror that plays in a space between the active nature of gaming and the ubiquitous lack of agency theme that is integral to folk horror. Also, you know, its pervading sense of pessimism, and I think those two things are the kind of key markers of folk horror. While there are some elements of folk horror in board games, such as those based on the Lovecraft mythos or those parented by comics or other media, such as the Lock and Key board game, my focus today is on video games across a range of game genres, mainly those that fall into the category of adventure or horror role-playing games, both single-player games and multiplayer games. So my interest is in the design, the game design, and the audiovisual affordances of game media in the context of the Gothic. My method is to wrap together attention to semiotics, storytelling, intertext, and game design, and the kind of ludic mechanics, all of which are active in the process of playing a game. In a way, we got text meets tech meets flesh. So my main approach is a comparative one, and I've had a long-standing interest in the way that cinema haunts games and vice versa, and the way in which the text might operate or be said to operate as a form of possession. I'm interested in the concept of possession and how it plays out. In many different ways, I guess, but mainly I'm interested in a comparative approach because I think that way you can see the specificity of the media that you're looking at and how that's affecting the text in a more clear manner. Now, I've argued elsewhere in a paper called Hands-on Horror that a game's programming, its AI or its rules, constitute and are experienced as a kind of occult force. You can't see them; they're literally hidden in a way that isn't the case when you're playing a board game. And that can then be leveraged against kind of folk horror or horror or Gothic kind of mechanics in very interesting ways. And throughout my academic career, overall, I've always been interested in the play of agency and power in occult fictions, and I'm interested in that in relation to game media. So there's a lot of work recently coming out on horror and gothic and hauntology in games, and just to mention a few of a notable few, Chris Darby's work, Ewan Kirkland's, Christian McRae, Dawn Stobart, and Bernard Perron are all people who are kind of writing in different ways about gothic and horror in games, but as yet nobody's really focused on folk horror, which is my intention here. So like Adam Scalville, my paper looks at the cross-medial interconnections. It's looking at patterns that cut across different media, intertexts and confluences, but also of course differences. I'm looking for folk horror lineages, but also to broaden out folk horror as more than simply a British post-war media. And some of the games that I will look at are really British post-war media, particularly the Chinese Room games. But nonetheless, I'm interested in the broader scope and also in the effect of game media on folk horror tropes. So some of the games I will talk about draw quite widely on different kinds of generic vocabularies, whereas others are more specifically looking at folk horror as their kind of main influence. So, for example, Year Walk draws on a combo of Lovecraft and Nordic folk tales. I'm not going to talk about it today, but also Munduan is an interesting game which I showed a screenshot of earlier, which is kind of looking at folk horror in a European context. Now, Scoville says, when tilling in fields of folk horror, it becomes apparent that the work discussed under such an umbrella is not necessarily always horror within any straightforward guise of the term, but simply a mutation of its effect. And some of the games that I look at today, particularly World of Warcraft, are in that mode. They're employing it as part of other things. They're not specifically or generically kind of very clearly horror. Although others much more so, including the game that I will talk about in a minute called Undying. So what are my principles here about what constitutes folk horror? I've already talked a bit about pessimism and sacrifice, but mainly I think folk horror is a mise en scène employed by games, which can often provide a critique of the normative, the pastoral and the familiar for dramatic purpose, but also to create an interesting and dramatic experience for the player. So folk horror staples obviously can be, important features: sacrifice, ritual, myth, horror, all deployed in various ways to unsettle an urban viewpoint, if you like, and often it's the rural, its people and its landscapes that become othered in the context of folk horror. And another aspect of this is also important to thinking about folk horror in games, and that is what Freud calls magical thinking. The idea that ritual or thought can affect change, can propitiate gods or the landscape or natural forces. And often that proves in that pessimistic way kind of futile, and that is interesting. So you can divide some games between those that have supernatural forces inherent in the landscape, and some where magic doesn't really exist; it only exists in the minds of magic users. But key to my argument is that in games the player can be more directly implicated in proceedings of folk horror, as their agency and actions can be directly and more tangibly played with, far more so than in movies. There's a very tangible sense that you can or cannot do things in games. So let's think about where folk horror can actually be found in games. I'm going to start here with Clive Barker's Undying. It's a first-person shooter it's got a more complex storyline than, say, Doom, which has kind of set the agenda for first-person shooters a little before the game came out. The basic storyline is Jeremiah read from a book at the Standing Stones as a joke, but the act unleashes a terrible force that corrupts his siblings, who all turn undead and need killing. Now, you're the player, Patrick, and you're indebted to the double-crossing Jeremiah, having served both in World War I. And you have to help him to break the curse he claims has been laid upon him and his family. This leads the player to kill Jeremiah's undead siblings, as well as the undying king, who's a Celtic king who was buried alive, and is apparently the source of the disturbance. So what folk horror tropes are there? Well, it's set in an isolated place where ancient stones are part of the landscape. There's the sacrifice of the undying king, which clearly draws on Fraser, who's also drawn on by the Wicker Man. There is the usual reliteralization of human sacrifice, in other words, a sort of de-civilization, which is what I mean about, a literal human sacrifice rather than a symbolic one. An undoing of civilization. The player has magical abilities to scry the landscape and see beyond the veil of illusions, which is employed ludically to help solve puzzles. There are RPG elements to this game, even though it's a first-person shooter, and it certainly has a strong claim to be the first folk horror game, I would argue. So folk horror provides the game with a more complex story than you'd normally get with FPS games of that era. But a lot of first-person shooters of that era have a very kind of simple storyline: kill the aliens, etc., kill the zombies. And really, folk horror provides the richness of the text. It provides the backstory. It provides the tropes. It gives it a kind of complexity that you would never normally get in a first-person context. However, the player is kind of very active, although in the end it turns out that in a very pessimistic sense that there's absolutely nothing that they could do. It's all fated, and the big bad is going to prevail. So thematically, the story is thickened by resonances with the struggle for Irish independence, and the dominance of the aristocracy, as well as the trauma of World War I. So an interesting game to start with, I think, mainly because it's a first, and folk horror is so strong in the game. Now I want to move on to the first of 3 walking simulators that I'm going to be talking about. And I think walking simulators are the games that seem to support folk horror in games in new and interesting ways, which is why I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on these. So the first of these is Dear Esther, and Dawn Stobart has written about this game in interesting ways, and she has noted the isolated setting of the game and its sense of gloom. She also notes that the landscape is more than simply a location. It's also a psychological space of mourning and loss. And there is a real sense of that throughout the game. And I think that's indicated, as you can see from the image, from the pervasive use of muted greys, which contrasts very strongly with the kind of strong red and yellow ochre of Undying, which was all about soil, dirt and blood, basically. Whereas this is kind of drained of colour, giving you a real sense of the draining of meaning that you get in a state of mourning. It's also contrast with Undying because Undying has a much greater sense of player agency, at least until the end, and a real sense of purpose. But in Esther, there's no real sense of purpose, no real sense of what our winning condition might be. It's just a question of uncovering pieces of information. And it's also incredibly slow pace, hence walking simulator. There's a real lack of agency and a very strong melancholic air. So Esther's folk horror is found in the isolated place, the muted ambience, the sense of being haunted or perhaps being dead yourself, guilt and loss. And the game's standing stones seem to represent not sacrifice or the excess of kings buried alive or any of that kind of like highly baroque kind of and dramatic stuff, but rather in here they stand in for the real of death, and this is very much a contemplation about the real of death. I'll now move on to talk about another Chinese room game called Everyone's Gone to the Rapture, which I think has even stronger connections with folk horror. Now this game has two incarnations where basically you get an updated graphics in the 2005 version, and I recommend if you play it that you look at that one. So in this game we've got an open world, there's non-linear storytelling, and like Esther it uses the stone tape idea that the landscape holds traces of human events that are replayed as a form of haunting. There's a real sense of elegy to doomed humanity in this game, drawing on many aspects of the British folk horror chain, and also, you know, the pervasive sense of pessimism that you get in a lot of folk horror. You arrive on an English Shropshire village at the very height of summer, well, early summer really, a real sense of the magical light of early summer on a sunny day. But it's been newly abandoned. Now, it's very clear as you're walking around that the date is very specific, the space is very specific. It's set in the 1980s. It's clearly a Shropshire village, you know, Middle England, if you like. Now, as you're walking around, you do see the traces of ghosts of communications, of people talking to each other. And this is the way that the story is told in it. And you follow the fates of 6 key characters in the space. I rather like to think of it as Quatermass meets the Archers, and every tale of dead country folk. The game is mainly exploratory and free roaming. The player affects no agency on the landscape or anything around it other than to understand what happened beforehand, or perhaps not understand what happened beforehand. So you're rather a witness rather than an active investigator. There's nothing really active about anything that you do. You're just a witness. The story structure is built into this exploration. It's kind of like radio plays delivered at various points, which are triggered depending on where you are and when you visit somewhere. It's not a branching narrative format. There's little choice other than to just be in the space and roam around. So you certainly have the freedom to wander and contemplate this space. There's certainly no frantic dealing with interfaces or hostile mobs, and I'll certainly come back to this idea that there's no action later. Given this more relaxed rhythm of play, more subtle componentry comes into play, perhaps best suited to the audio-visual poetics of folk horror. And certainly this game feels to me like visual poetry with this folk horror undertow. So the game makes use of graphical realism to heighten the sense of a real space. And also this higher resolution means that because there's not so many actions that the player can do, means that there's more resources available to create interesting lighting effects and highly resolved visual ambience. So the lack of an animated character certainly means that it's not you as a player that takes center stage. It's the landscape. You really have no idea who you are. You're just there. There's also an awful lot of the use of what you might think of as golden magic hour light, and gentle mists help provide this elegiac sense of melancholy. And there's lots of echoes of Reevesian landscapes here. If you're watching Witchfinder General, there's kind of these subtle echoes between the two texts. Now the other here is enigmatic. The other here is about enigmatic beings. These beings that have turned into pure energy. How have they become that? How have they been harvested? What happened here? Is very opaque and hard to follow. But at the same time, there's this incredible intrigue provided through audio-visual means. And it's worth dwelling on Rapture's landscape because of this. So Rapture presents its agrarian human landscape and all humanity as poised on the brink of extinction. The sense of an impending loss keeps the player very much in the moment, a sense of presentness intensified as elegy. This soon-to-be-lost sensibility is underlined by the game's captivating, constable-esque pastoral vistas. Everywhere you go, there are beautiful lines of sight across this idyllic pastoral location. Now, in most games, presentness is defined by doing, coping, and mastering the crazy stuff that's thrown at you or the puzzles that are thrown at you. This is not the case in Rapture, and why I can claim that the player is more of a witness and a sightseer than a player. Now, Oscar Moraldi, writing about Esther, says, landscape makes an ideological claim that human intention both frames and leaves its traces on the land, and nature fills in all the spaces between. This specific conception of landscape flows from the conventions of Renaissance perspective in a landscape painting or photograph. The elements of the land converge towards the player's position in a pleasing way, and in so doing implies the singularity of that static viewpoint as an ideal abstract position of power. Now, I go with that quote as far as the end, the abstract position of power. Now, in Rapture, this power has been lost alongside a loss of the pastoral, or an impending sense that the pastoral is about to be lost. There is no sense of power here. There is only a sense of not being able to affect any change whatsoever. Now, in Rapture, the singularity of the viewpoint is configured as ultimately isolated, fleeting, and just about to be lost. In the game, you are configured as human, and it's implied that you will, or may have already, suffered the same fate as all those others who are only seen in the game as ghosts. There is no active power here. Rapture's sightseeing is not surveying. It is not management. It is an act of witness and of mourning. The landscape is constructed around this trajectory towards loss, and unlike Lord of the Rings' Hobbiton, it cannot be fought for, as there is no agency available to fight for it. This is a counterweight to the usual heroic patterns and winning conditions that are present in games, in many games. So this game goes against the usual winning, heroic, mastery rhetoric that we get in most games. All you, the player, can do is bear witness, and this is an important way that the game links to the pessimism of folk horror. The landscape is not Vitruvian, as in other games, and what I mean by that is most game spaces are designed to affect and support player agency. You know, think of jumping in Tomb Raider. You know, jumps are designed exactly to enable the player to hit a sweet spot and jump that ravine. You often fail, but nonetheless it's designed around player agency. This is much less apparent in the ludic design of Rapture. The landscape in Rapture is in effect in excess of gameplay mechanics. It's all a bit monstrous because it's not architected to define your path and progress. Much as agrarian landscape functions visually in folk horror elsewhere, so let's look at some examples. So landscape. So this is a screenshot from Rapture. Beautifully rendered shadows, a sense of perspective, using Renaissance perspective. But you know, there's nothing you can do here. It's just about to go. So Rapture's dynamic lighting, recreating the pastoral idyll of an English countryside summer's day, already lost, genetically connecting the game to folk horror. And this is Hobbiton in the online version of Lord of the Rings online, and this is what you're fighting for. So this is, you know, this is the English pastoral idyll that we're fighting Mordor for. So compare Lotro, Bag End, an idyll of the pastoral home to battle for. Contrast with the wildwood where the trees will attack you and pull you down into their roots, the hostile Barrow Downs and Mordor. Here the trees let the sky in. The trees here are not threatening. They are absolutely about creating a pastoral, idyllic space. Here, by contrast, and this is Rapture, we have the summer fields, the ripened crops, all the sorts of things that we expect from ritual offerings, Lammas, harvest festival, all that sort of stuff. And here we have somebody who's turned into pure energy, a transformation from human into light. But the thing that we see here visually, not only is the person turned into pure light, is the backdrop of the trees, which provide a great backdrop to seeing, you know, the glow of the energy, but also it stops your sightlines. These are trees that are not designed to let the human have the gaze and power over a Renaissance perspective on the landscape. I became very interested in these dark tree lines in relation to sight lines. And actually when I went back and looked at a lot of folk horror, we see that all over the place, that the trees are absolutely about a lack of, not allowing you the power of being able to see sight lines. So this is a screenshot from Witchfinder General. We have the dazzling light coming through the trees here. This is also stopping you being able to see. The brightness of the light is dazzling. It stops you seeing. And it reminds me a little bit of the Wicker Man, the final shot in the Wicker Man, where we see the sun unblinking, looking on, or looking hardly, or ignoring what's happening in the human world, and ignoring what's happening through the ritual. The trees here are a web, a cage, stopping you seeing anything. So the light and the trees here are not pastoral, they are monstrous. This is Witch, and I'm sure you recognise the grey palette from this film. Once again, the trees creating a barrier, and kind of isolating this small village, surrounding it, lowering over it. We can think of Macbeth's forest, the forest that walks, Tolkien's Fangorn, all of that kind of stuff. But this idea that in a way the trees are kind of like, with their skeletal branches, tracing weird fateful tendrils. This is a deeply pessimistic visual vocabulary. This is from Blood on Satan's Claw. We can see these tendrils of branches obscuring the camera and your gaze. You are just a little bit. You're obviously positioned as human, looking through these branches. These bony fingers breaking up the pastoral unity. So trees once again becoming monstrous. And lastly, trees are acting as boundaries and keeping people in. This is a field in England, as you might recognise. And once again, as in Witch and in the other examples, these are trees that bound space, that curtail human progress, that don't that don't allow an ability to see beyond, limiting human reach and agency. And once again, this is a screenshot from Witchfinder General. The tree line here, kind of cutting into the gallows. It's a visual design designed to show that there is a boundary between life and death, perhaps, between the agrarian and the sky, that kind of stuff. And arboreal myth-making, as we might call it, we can also see in some recent folk horrors like Black Spot, the Dark Forest, No Sight Lines, folk horror landscape is not just design, therefore. The landscape itself is animistic, it's threatening, it's sentient, and it's agentic, and it's got far greater and more mysterious agency than any of the people that it is affecting. This is the Upside Down, another scene from a field in England, and in a way I like this because it's sort of turning the trees upside down, so that you can see their roots, and of course that well, you can't see their roots in this instance, but the idea of the tree roots going down deep into the earth, into the soil, is something that we see a lot in folk horror iconography. So I've just done a short excursion into the visual uses of landscape in folk horror, particularly around trees, and we can see that this ties together both games with cinema as visual media. And so landscape used as environmental storytelling. So let's go back to our games again. Now, Year Walk is a small-scale indie game, also a walking simulator, like the other two that we've looked at. And it was the game was originally for the iPad. It's about a 4 to 5 hour game. Players navigate the space looking for clues and solving puzzles. They switch between maps and tightly controlled traversable landscapes, as well as consulting an encyclopedia of relevant folklore and a journal. So all of those things are the ways in which the game tells stories. So the puzzles orient around the swipe actions of the original platform. You don't need a mouse to play the game. It was designed for you to kind of interact with your finger on the screen. Ostensibly, you, the player, undertake an ancient Swedish rite of passage ritual undertaken when the veil between the worlds is thin. Now, the artwork is very different to Rapture. It's illustrative and there's a limited colour palette. The settings, which are woods, trees, a church, as well as the drowned children, the strong presence of fate and fatefulness, murder and madness bring horror to this folkloric milieu. It is the one game I discussed that represents itself as a folkloric adaptation. The player has more agency in the game than they do in Rapture. The elegant puzzles are quite demanding, even if the hints are used, and if you don't cheat, require thought and research in the documents provided in the game. The puzzles help build richness into the story, enabling the various folkloric characters, the Brook Horse, Mirelings, Night Raven, the Huldra, and the Church Grim, to be better understood. More of a sense of solving a mystery here, possibly preventing a murder. However, a strong sense of preordained fate is present, lending pessimism and giving a non-agentic quality to the ritual. The ending also attempts to break the fourth wall. Your screen appears to crack on confronting the Church Grim. And from this point on, you enter into some other space of geometry. I'm thinking Dreams in the Witch House here, for those of you who know the Lovecraft tale. Now, Esther, Rapture and Yearwalk are all walking simulators. And I'll come back to the importance of walking simulator in relation to folk horror in a bit. But I'm now going to switch to game genres to a multiplayer role-playing game called World of Warcraft. This is a game that's been going for nigh on 18 years now, and this game is a very different kind of game, but it draws on folk horror in some rather different ways to the walking simulators and provides a good comparison. Now, World of Warcraft so the main storyline evolves around the idea that there's some demons from outer space, or the old ones, who are trying to control Azeroth, which is the world of Warcraft. Within this game, there are different races and different perspectives on history and events, and you choose a faction or you choose a race when you log on as a new player. Now, it's mainly the human world that pertain to the use of folk horror in the game, and the human world, the kind of religion there is partly a paladin culture, but it's about a celebration of light. And this suggests so that the whole kind of Church of the Holy Light, all of that kind of religion leads to quests that are often about demonic possession. So in the human world, as opposed to the other races, there's werewolves, demonic possession, and other races, particularly on the horde side, are mainly shamanic. So demonic possession doesn't really have any purchase there, which is also interesting. But it's mainly the humans within which folk horror tropes are deployed. And often that creates, the material for quests, conflicts, storylines, and a culture. So the game draws very liberally on existing text. It's an incredibly intertextual game. In building a world, it draws on our world in many ways. And this is all designed to create a rich text, to create a sense of familiarity and otherness, but also to create a sense of multiple cultures. Now, one of the festivals that happens yearly in World of Warcraft is the Hallows End Festival. And the Hallows End Festival obviously calls on a great deal of folk horror, and we can see that just in the visual iconography and some of the temporary quests that appear annually with Hallows End. Now, World of Warcraft does tend to use a cartoon style. This means that, in a way, that sort of drains some of the power of away from the use of horror iconography. But nonetheless, we do get references to atrocities, possessions, zombification, sacrifice, dismemberment, necromancy, etc. So here's some of the ways in which the folk horror is used, and I'm going to go through a number of images here. Okay, so this is a recent incarnation of the Wicker Man event, which started at the beginning of the game at Halloween, but over the years has kind of evolved, and actually even the humans are now celebrate Hallows End, whereas they didn't at the beginning of the when the game started. So here's some iconography for Halloween. We've got the headless horseman, pumpkin heads. Use of masks, the kind of thing we would expect. But we also have alchemy and necromancy iconography that's used throughout the games, referring to real world magics, that kind of stuff. There's also references to Lord of the Rings, demons, that kind of stuff. Things that we all recognise. Now, in one of the expansions, the humans were being village is being attacked by demons. Some of the animals have become possessed, the birds have become hostile. There's a lot of kind of references to usual folk horror kind of iconography. You can see here the goats, and you can see here the corn and hostile birds. Now, when I investigated this quest, I was kind of interested in the landscape around that area. There's a kind of a house on the cliffs and some kind of fairly demonic looking trees. And lo and behold, in a very obscure little place, what did I find? I found Black Phillip. And nearby, oh, here's more Black Phillip, because I was very pleased to have found Black Phillip. Here's a shrine to Black Phillip. And nearby there's also a stone circle. So we're getting a lot of references to the kind of usual iconography of folk horror. We also have references to The Exorcist. So this is Anchorite Barada, who is performing an exorcism on this person, using all of the iconography and vocabulary of exorcism in The Exorcist. And later on, we have a whole kind of series of quests that are around the witch cult of Culterus, which is kind of uses a combination of what you might think of as Witchfinder General iconography meets Monty Python. If you're a Horde player, you don't see any of this. I actually had to make an Alliance character to see all this, because of course with the Horde, you know, any kind of this kind of stuff, you know, as shamanic people, they're not interested. Well, this stuff doesn't make any sense to them. They're, you know, which is kind of interesting axiom in the game. A few more images. Yeah, compelling souls, meeting Bowen Samdi, the Lord of Death, the Lower of Death. And of course sea monsters, because we couldn't get away with sea monsters. And one of my favourite quests ever was a sea monster quest in an early WoW, where you had to fight Tethys, a sea monster. So sort of Lovecraftian elements. There's many Lovecraftian elements in the game. So here's the Tethys quest. Now, so that's one multiplayer game that I wanted to refer to in relation to folk horror, but the second one I want to refer to is The Secret World. This is possibly my favourite multiplayer game ever. So Secret World is the only game I've ever played where I actually had to look at a real book ISBN number and look up a Poe story called the Gold Bug in order to solve puzzles. It's a really interesting game, and I've written about it quite a lot. Lots of references to Lovecraft and Stephen King. So just a little bit of a look through the iconography here. So this is another world, but it's set in this real world, although you know, and there is a huge amounts of references to Lovecraft and Stephen King in the first area that you visit. You have superpowers, yeah. Cosmic forces, however, are in play. You choose a faction. You could be Illuminati or Templar or all those kinds of things. And the whole kind of basis of the game is everything is true. Chaos magic rather than fantasy then is the referent. There's a lot of urban, agrarian, remote locations that make up the world, including Romania and Transylvania. There's a lot of core American Gothic tropes in the levels that are set in America. So your first destination is Kingsmouth, which is stuck in Halloween, basically, besieged by Drogs, awakened dead Vikings, that kind of stuff. And you need to search for occult power that's connected to the Illuminati. Then when you move to Transylvania, actually via Egypt, you step into folktale. So here's a few examples of the kind of iconography and reference that's being used. This is in Transylvania. This is modern day Transylvania, so you've got references to Transylvanian myth beyond the usual sort of Dracula myth. You've got references to Stonehenge, which is an area where you can raid. Right. Okay. So I've really covered quite a lot of ground in terms of the genres and and certain games that use folk horror iconography. What then is the overriding function of horror in games? This depends largely on the genre of the game in question. For the multiplayer online game, folk horror is just one element of a wider scheme of world building, and in so doing a theme used to create a distinctive culture that helps make up the world's diversity. As was evident with the use of folk horror in Kulturas in World of Warcraft, folk horror storytelling can be used to generate ludic situations necessary for players to engage with in the promise of heroic deeds. In WoW, folk horror elements give cultural shape to the human race, allowing the game to reflect ourselves back to ourselves as what we would normally see in the other. In all the games discussed, folk horror provides paratextual sustenance that thicken and quicken ludic storytelling. WoW, for example, uses the theme of corruption against which players can engage, whatever their faction or race. Folk horror provides in this game a framework for ludic world building. Now, the use of folk horror in the context of walking simulators, we have discussed, helps create a unified atmospheric milieu where the world is driven by a single story, much like most films or novels, rather than the multitudinous and competing stories in the context of World of Warcraft or The Secret World. Games like Yearwalk and Rapture are all set in places that were once inhabited by human beings, but which are now empty of them bar their ghosts. The first-person format of these games create both intimacy with the terrain and a sense of perceptual immediacy. There are no characters, factions or races through which the player is mediated into the space. As is the case in role-playing games such as WoW. This affects the way that folk horror functions textually. The slow pace of the walking simulator allows the story to unfold for a witness or sightseer. This more contemplative context allows these games to paint with light, to create environments that do not support storytelling, but are themselves storytellers, often creating a form of ludic horror that is marked as a pastoral poetic that carries with it the mystique of earth mysteries. In this environmental storytelling context, nuances and small differences count large. With no narrator or non-playing characters to locate the player, emphasis on environment becomes a core route to delivering story, and it is in this way that the past is called into the present. While ritual might be present, it carries something of folly and error rather than full-on magical mastery. Both. Even in WoW, this is the case, yet the encounter with sacrifice, death and loss helps to reveal the illusion of our magnificent yet fallacious sense of agency. Ludic horror is therefore able to depart from gaming norms. They do follow a Vitruvian pattern. They do not follow a Vitruvian pattern, nor are they built to bolster flagging egos. Walking simulators are often regarded by gamers as very limited and do not afford players with a pleasurable sense of mastery. Instead, they do afford room for contemplation and construct very powerfully a sense of nostalgia for places and time lost to us. In our depleted and decaying Anthropocene world, that focus on a lost environment is suitably apt. Games regularly present players with ordered progress-led experiences. Rituals in the form of prescribed and repeated key press sequences are the very stuff that games are made on. This might provide an antidote to what Johann Huizinga called the confusion of life. However, in ludic horror, players are not fully in control. It is here that playing a ludic horror game can begin to approach something closer to the strangeness of our existence and to our Earth's deep mysteries. It is this pessimism that marks out ludic folk horror from other games? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. We've got about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. First of all, so I'm going to ask people if they want to put a question in the chat, as we've been doing so far. If you want to indicate if you want to read your own question, or have me read it for you. So if people want to start putting things in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. To get us started, I really enjoyed your paper. I thought it was really sort of fascinating, and particularly I really liked the the very different approaches to gaming. And I guess one of the things I was wondering was I was thinking about some of the debates about cinematic horror, about certain different styles, and I was thinking the walking ones, particularly the Rapture, which I kept thinking I have to play this game, struck me as being almost like that art horror approach, that somehow it seems to be, it's as something different. And I wondered is that a fair comparison, that you have something that is kind of playing with that kind of art horror versus a more, for lack of a better word, a more mainstream horror?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think if you think about how much it costs to make a multiplayer online game, that's the equivalent of a Hollywood AAA movie. Yeah. Whereas the smaller games like the Chinese Room game and Year Walk, and also there's a few around. There's another one called Mont Dawn, and all of those ones are small budget games that kind of can take more risks because there's not so much, there's not so much investment in them. And also, I think with indie games, that they are actually going for a different kind of audience than the kind of first-person shooter audience. And that's why I was interested in putting up Undying, because Undying thought that it could go for a mainstream gamer audience through the first-person shooter. But that game bombed. It really didn't. There was a few of us that bought it, but not many.
No, that's really helpful, because then that tied into my next question, was about the different types of users and different types of, gamers and how they engage with it. So thank you, that's really helpful. Merlin's got a question, and he's saying he's happy to voice his own question. So I'm going to ask Merlin to present himself.
Hi there. Thank you very much for that paper, Tanya. It's really fascinating stuff, and all stuff which I love very deeply.
Thank you.
And I'm also writing about horror in games, and landscape and bodies are where my kind of question comment falls. So basically, I'd love you to talk a bit more about Unbound, which I really love, and I'm working on a bit of a thesis about currently. But I was really interested in the way you're embracing very different kind of cultural origins of game, or whether there's a sense here there are very different kinds of landscape. The Swedish landscape versus the British landscape versus the Swiss landscape. And the way in which this also seems to involve the body in different ways, wherein you have these sort of interesting disembodied voices and everyone's gone to the Rapture. There's a sense of almost like the horror of radio. It's this kind of radio signal from outer space, which disembodies humans. Through to the kind of way in which, like, Year Walk is, of course, a touch interface game. And Unbound has all its assets, all the textures are hand-drawn with graphite and charcoal. So there's a really interesting kind of sense of like the body in the landscape. And of course, folk horror is all about kind of the body isolated in landscape in different ways. But yeah, basically, should have made more thoughts on Unbound and that kind of configuration of landscape body. That'd be really interesting to hear.
Well, I was really grateful somebody pointed me in the direction of Unbound fairly recently. And when I first played it, it bothered me that the textures stretched all the time on the models, because that's not good from a kind of conventional viewpoint. But actually, there are times when it works really well, because it really puts you into, it feels really wrong, because it is, but well, I thought it took some really interesting risks. I have to say, I like it in principle better than I do in terms of playing the game. I found it a bit kind of clunky in some senses. So I'm interested to say, for you to tell me what you thought was interesting about it.
So my interest is, I come from an art history background. I'm very interested in aesthetics in games. And so actually when you're talking about passivity and agency, I'm quite interested in the fact that games are actually often very passive. And we think about in chess, we spend most of our time thinking, not doing, or when we play PUBG or like a battle royale game, we spend a lot of time waiting for someone to come along, or between turns or during cutscenes. And I love, like you're saying, the sort of folk horror draws attention to the way in which games can negate agency or play with that, because they're always offering us, if they do offer us agency, a kind of limited sense of that. And in Mundown, I really love just the aesthetics of it and those assets, where it seems to be all about traces to me in different ways. I talk of it as a horror of hills, honey, and hay, in the way that it's all kind of about very tactile materials. And in the sort of the shadow of war, it talks about Swiss history and the way in which borders were crossed and the kind of confusing topography of the Alps during World War I. And you have these really quite, I think, just great use of textures, wherein we don't often talk about, I guess, the texture of non-interactive assets in games, or in fact their role in the visual schema.
I think if you're in games, you do. And I think the use of charcoal was interesting because obviously, you know, this guy's been burnt to death.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting to talk to you if we were at a real conference where we, you know, I'd love to talk to you more about it, but we probably should move on to more questions. But thank you for that.
Thank you, Merlin. That's great. Thank you. Yes, we have a couple more questions building up, so that's great. Kendall Phillips asked me to read it, so I'll read it. So I'm wondering if Tanya might talk a bit more about how the witnessing position offers a different kind of ethics of engagement, especially in terms of humility, but also in terms of creating empathy for others.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're playing a first-person shooter or you're playing Left 4 Dead or something like that, you don't consider anything. You know, all the beings in it are kind of designed as kind of cannon fodder. You know, whether they're zombies or aliens or whatever. You can just, you know, you can mow them down with alacrity. And there's no sense that you kind of, you know, oh no, I really like this cute alien that's going to kill me if I don't, you know. So your contract with the game is kill these things in order to kind of win the level or whatever, or get through the level or reveal the story. And what's interesting about the walking simulators is that actually, you know, that kind of frenetic pacing and that usual contract with the game is kind of subverted. So that you're not simply being invited to kind of slay everything in sight. And there's a really interesting game called Spec Ops: The Line where that really backfires on you. You think you can do that, and I'm not going to give that one away. But if you're interested in a game that plays first-person shooter type mechanics at you, but then shows what the ethics of that is. Then Spec Ops: The Line is where to go to look.
Thank you. That's great. That's great. Thank you. We have another question now from Stephen Curtis, who's also asked that I read it. It says, I'm interested in the potential for ludic folk horror to immerse and inform players in and of different cultural folk horrors. He says, I'm thinking of a series of Eastern European folk horror inflected games often set around forests.
The Witcher comes to mind. I don't know how many people have come across The Witcher. I mean, that started off as a set of novels. I haven't read them, so but yeah, I'm aware of the game, particularly the third one, The Wild Hunt, and obviously there's the series now. You know, East European folk tales, many kind of wrapped into that. So there is already a precedent there. But more and more Indigenous people are thinking about making games as new ways of telling their folk stories. And there is, you know, I'm aware of quite a lot of people doing that at the moment. It's a really interesting area for game development. The more elements of making games become automated, that gives it. That takes it out of the specialist camp and means that more and more people can use them, use game form to start telling their own stories. And I'm really, you know, interested in how that plays out.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. So those are really good questions. I've just checked the clock and we're now at kind of the end of our time. So I think it's a really good opportunity for us to thank Tanya for what was a really, really great and insightful keynote on gaming and struggling.